Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and happy to welcome you back to our summer series on the dynamics of change. Hope everyone had a good July 4th week or extra long weekend or whatever you did. I guess I should address that to those here in the States, but we know we have people from all over learning with us. So whatever country you're in, whatever holidays you have or haven't celebrated recently, we're happy to have you with us, and especially special welcome to those joining us for the first time today. So I have been looking forward to this particular session with Rabbi Eliezer Diamond. Rabbi Diamond, we're so happy to have you back teaching us today. We haven't had you in a while in our Monday series. But I've been particularly looking forward to this one because Rabbi Diamond's session is called The Power of Words, How What We Say Affects Us and Those Around Us. And I think this is kind of the most inward-looking session in this series. We've been talking a lot about larger things as opposed to what's happening within us and between us in our interpersonal lives. So we're really looking forward to this session on the impact of speech. And we don't have any sponsors today, but we would love to encourage more sponsors. All of your gifts and the sponsorship gifts especially are really what make this series possible. So we have multiple sponsorship levels. We'll post a link in the chat and hope that many of you will consider that option. And now I will turn it over to Tani Schwartz-Herman for a couple of additional announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over the format for our session, as we usually do, Rabbi Diamond will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Rabbi Diamond. Since we receive a large number of questions, we would appreciate it if you could express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll also be screen sharing a PowerPoint presentation. So pleased to have Rabbi Diamond teaching us today. Dr. Eliezer Diamond is the Rabbi Judah Nadich Associate Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics.
I have to correct that because I am now the Rabbi Judah Nadich Professor.
Thank you for the correction, just as it was coming out of my mouth. I was thinking the same thing myself, so sorry about that. Rabbi Judah Nadich, Professor of Talmud and Rabbinics at JTS. He teaches courses in rabbinic literature and Talmud studies. Dr. Diamond has written on prayer, asceticism, and issues of environmental law and ethics. He has taught in a variety of settings, including Stern College, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, the 92nd Street Y, and also several Ramah camps. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Rabbi Diamond.
So, thank you very much, Rabbi Andelman and Tani. Speaking of teaching at Stern, so I've been posting on Facebook lately, and I got a note from someone who is a student in a course that I taught at Stern in the prehistoric era. And she had written a paper on kosher cheese, which I actually remember that she had written that paper. The course was about kashrut. And she said something nice about the class. Frankly, I did not remember it as one of my stellar accomplishments, and it was nice to get a positive note. So Rabbi Andelman described this as looking inward. So in my note, I described this session as an outlier because it is basically, we're saying it for the same reasons. It's different from what we've talked about before, but I do want to make the case for it being part of the series. And I will read what I wrote down for myself. Previous sessions have taught from a historical perspective. My passion is religious character formation. It has been a lifelong project, beginning with myself. I have read widely on the subject and spoken about it on many occasions. I also have done my best to apply it to my relationship with students. Indeed, we will be talking about change, but in the personal and social contexts. That's the kinds of change that we're talking about. I want together with you to examine the power of words. They can be every bit as significant as actions. And mainly we're going to examine it by examining the significance of names in the Bible, in rabbinic literature, and contemporary society. My choice of names as a focus has to do with the fact that many names are intended to characterize us in some way. You know, if I'm named after so-and-so, partially we do that to honor the person after whom we've been named. My first name, to take an example out of the air, is Eliezer, named after Yaakov Eliezer, or Jacob Goldstone, my great-grandfather, my mother's grandfather. Ben Sion, my middle name, is after my father's grandfather, who he never met and about which I almost know nothing. But I do think about those names, and I think about the ways in which I carry responsibility to, I don't know, you finish the sentence. I'm not always sure how to finish that sentence, but somehow, there's some sense of responsibility. I'm not just me. I'm Yaakov Eliezer's great-grandson. I'm Ben Sion Diamond's great-grandson. So that's one thing. But also, sometimes we give names because of what they mean. And we want to confer some significance on a person by giving them that name. And of course, that happens in the Bible all the time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in talking about names, because they can encapsulate a narrative, a story about someone, we are going to use that as a way of talking about how people talk about each other through names. And I'm using the term names broadly. In other words, it can be, I hereby christen you the SS, Chaim Yankel, whatever it is. Or it can mean, I say, oh, you're, as a young man once said to me when I was the rabbi for Yamim Noraim in a synagogue in Albany. I was walking down the hall, I think it was the first day of Rosh Hashanah. There were a bunch of teenagers, and one of them turned around and saw me and said, oh, you're the rent-a-rabbi. Now, it's not inaccurate, but in giving me that name, he obviously was putting me in a certain box, right? You're here to do what we need you to do, and then see ya. There are many other ways that I could have been described, but he was giving me a name and giving me that description. And maybe let me introduce an important distinction right now. And that distinction is between description and characterization. Description. This person is often not successful at what that person tries to do. Characterization. That guy is a loser. There's a big difference between those two. And part of what I want to get at today is to talk about how the names, whether they're literally names or characterizations, can support someone or destroy someone. My talk today is influenced by 3 books, and they are the following: Damaged Identities, Narrative Repair by Hilda Lindemann Nelson, Holding and Letting Go, The Social Practice of Personal Identities by Hilda Lindemann, and Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect by Matthew D. Lieberman. And what these books talk about is the social nature of identity, right? We create our own identity, we express it through what we say and what we do. But we do that in a social context. And then it's up to other people to decide what to do. So ideally, other people take in who we are, and then they reflect it back to us. They support our self-declared identity. But of course, that's not always what happens. Sometimes people reject that identity, or they subsume it under another identity that erases my personal identity. So I'm, I don't know, a physician who has won awards, and I'm Black. To some people, I'm a physician who has won awards. To other people, I'm Black. That's it. That's the identity that they put on me, and it's impossible to get past that. So that will be key to what we're talking about. Now, talking about names, there was a poem that I wish I had included in the sources, but life happens, and I actually didn't think of it until too late, but I can still read it to you. We still have ears to hear. So this is the poem. It's by the poet Zelda. Zelda was a very unusual personality. She was a sign of the Schneerson family in Chabad. She was a cousin, actually, of the last Lubavitcher Rebbe. One of her students, just interesting factoid, one of her students was Amos Klausner, who became Amos Oz. And he writes how many, many years after he was her student, I mean, he was a kid when he was her student, he came to visit her. She lived in exactly the same house she lived in when she was teaching him. And not only did she remember him, but she remembered that he liked the lemonade that she made. So it was a very touching moment for him. So here is her poem. In Hebrew, it's called L'chol ish yesh shem. In English, each of us has a name. This translation is by Marcia Falk. Each of us has a name given by God and given by our parents. Each of us has a name given by our stature and our smile and given by what we wear. Each of us has a name given by the mountains and given by our walls. That part sounds better in the Hebrew, by the way. Each of us has a name given by the stars and given by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given by our sins and given by our longings. Each of us has a name given by our enemies and given by our love. Each of us has a name given by our celebrations and given by our work. Each of us has a name given by the seasons and given by our blindness. Each of us has a name given by the sea and given by our death. If I'm not mistaken, by the way, you can find this poem in the Machzor Lev Shalem.
I just posted a link to
Yeah,
it.
okay, thank you, appreciate it. But I think for those of you who have the Machzor Lev Shalem, this Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, when you're sitting there and you can't think of what to do, you can leaf through the Machzor and find the poem. Reading during services was, I'm all in favor of it. Okay, so let's start by looking at sources 2 and 3, where we see that, oh, by the way, source 1 was just kind of a throwaway. Remember how Juliet says in Romeo and Juliet, has go Rose by any other name. Here we go. I think I would remember it. What's in a name? There you go. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. Well, yeah, but actually there is something in a name. I mean, in her context, she's saying that the only reason I can't be together with Romeo is because of his last name, and that's ridiculous. But in truth, names are very important. So now let's look at sources 2 and 3. Obviously, first 2, then 3. Okay, and what we learn is that at the very beginning of the world, it begins with words and it begins with naming. So God said, let there be light, and there was light. And of course, only God can create through speech alone. This is what we say in the Baruch She'amar prayer, Baruch Omer Va'oseh. Blessed is the one who says and does, through saying does. I'll come back to the idea in a moment. So God said that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. However God did that, I don't know. And then God called the light day and called the darkness night. And there was evening and there was morning of first day, or a day. Not disagreement how to translate those last two Hebrew words, Yom Echad. So God creates through words, and he uses names to give identity to those things that God creates. And it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have the answer exactly. Why is it important for God to give these things names? But clearly, names give boundaries and they give clarity. So if we just had darkness and light and we didn't have names for them, then time perhaps would feel like more of a blur. But now we have names. So, oh, okay, this is night, I know that. Oh, this is, or light, and this is darkness, I know that. So this idea of naming is an important part of creation. Now, what I wanted to say is, on the one hand, there's an emphasis here on the fact that God can create through words, and we cannot. But I think that what we are supposed to learn from this verse, or what we could choose to learn from this verse, is we may not be able to bring things into existence simply by saying something, but words have creative power for human beings as well, for better and for worse. And again, we can see that one of the areas in which we can see that is in the area of names. So let's go on to source 3. And God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the skies, and brought them to the human to see what he would call them. It is a he. And whatever the human called each living creature, that would be its name. Now, this is a curious passage. Why would God choose to do this? Now, of course, in context, it leads to the idea that first human encounters all of these animals and doesn't find a partner in them. So on one level, you could say that the reason God needs Adam to name all the animals is for the human being to discover and to yearn for a partner, to see that there is no partner. And maybe yearning for a partner increases one's appreciation when one finds that partner. That being said, I think that God is inviting human beings to be godly by being namers, just like God. That is, I assume, although I could be wrong, did Adam call, I know this is not the word Adam would have used, but rhinoceros, because it rhymes with imposterous? Or did Adam choose that name because Adam saw some quality in that animal that was reflected in the name that was that Adam gave to that animal? I have to assume that naming is about understanding. I give you a name or a description because I see something in you. And a name or a description is a good way of encapsulating that. It is a sidebar here because it's important in any case, and it'll become important later on. This is a dangerous activity because nobody is one thing. And there is a value in this encapsulation. But sometimes a person can get frozen in that place. Either that's self-imposed or the people around me do that to me. So names are necessary, but they can be dangerous. So we have to be aware. And now actually we're going to see such a case, in my opinion. Okay, so there's no helpmeet, as many translations have it, for Adam. And so God puts the man to sleep and draws forth a tzela, let's say it's a rib, from man's body and fashions a woman. And what does Adam or the human say? Then the human said, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from a human she was taken." Now, what you lose in this translation is, the Hebrew is, she is called Isha because she was taken from an Ish. So Isha is a female man, right? There's no word that identifies a woman in a totally unique way. It's just as she is physically derivative from Adam's body, her identity is derivative. She's an Isha, a woman man. And by the way, in English, the word woman is originally from the Old English wolfman, not wolfman, wolfman. And it means wife man or wife of man. So to identify a woman in this way is to freeze her in this subsidiary position. And names, unfortunately, often do that. And I won't, sort of beat this to death, but I just want to say it one more time so that we're all having this in our heads. When I'm talking about people, giving people names, I'm not just talking about whether we decide to call someone Mortimer or Sam. We give names in a variety of ways, including how we describe them, how we think about them. So everything that we're saying about names in the literal sense applies to all of the different ways in which we identify and characterize ourselves and others. Okay. By the way, you know that at a certain point, some feminists decided to spell the word woman W-O-M-Y-N. And this was a way of saying, no, I'm not a wolf man. I'm not a wife man. I'm somebody else. And I assume the Y refers to the female anatomy. I could be wrong. But in any case, it was a way of saying, no, that name doesn't work for me because that name freezes me in a subsidiary position, and I'm not willing to accept it. Okay, let's move on to source 4. Okay, and now we're going to be talking about through the example of Yaakov, Jacob. We're going to be talking about several aspects of names. And one is that this very same name, the name that I have, can be seen as a badge of honor, but it can be subverted and turned into a badge of shame. So why was Yaakov called Yaakov? Because the Torah tells us in Genesis 25:26, V'yado ochezet ba'akev Esav. Esau was born first, but Jacob was grasping Esau's heel. Now, you could see that as, foretelling something negative. Even at birth, Jacob is trying to forestall Esau's progress. But I don't think we have to see it as negative. But in any case, when we get to Genesis 27:36, and Jacob has just stolen the blessing from Esau, Esau said, "Was he then named Jacob?" Now, this translation, I'm going to reject all the translations on the screen, and I'll explain why. But I translate it as, "He might supplant or snatch away from me through stealth these two times. First, he took away my birthright, and now he has taken away my blessing." I'm going to suggest a different translation for the Hebrew, Vaya'akveni. So Vaya'akveni is related to Yaakov. And Vaya'akveni can be translated as, he circumvented me. He got around me, or like we say in English, somebody got over on me. He got around me. So he's taking this name, Yaakov, and he is stamping it with a negative connotation. Not changing Jacob's name, but he's saying, let me tell you what that name really means. What it really means is that Jacob is a sneak, is a trickster. If you want, he's a heel. That's what it's doing. And it made me think about, as I was thinking about this and looked at that verse, something that happened to me, unfortunately. I think it's the first time that it happened in this particular way, although people may or may not understand that if you wear a kippah in Manhattan, you will get anti-Semitic remarks. I know we're Manhattan and all of that, but it still happens. So I was walking towards the subway station, and the guy was walking the other direction. We were both walking pretty quickly, and as this person passed me, he said, "Jew." And kept walking quickly. So my first thought was, you're a coward. If you stopped in front of me and said Jew, all right, but then, this is a hit and run. But second of all, what made me really sad was, I say I'm a Jew, and to me, it's a badge of pride. Yes, being a Jew is a wonderful thing. But this guy didn't have to say dirty Jew or sneaky Jew or Jew. In this person's mind, it was enough to call me a Jew. That identity itself was shameful. And what's her name again? Nelson, in her book, what did I say the name was? Damaged Identities, talks about infiltrated consciousness, which means that we take in other people's negative perceptions of us too often. And in the case of Jew, you can see this in the history of names of organizations, of Jewish organizations in the United States. Most of them in the 19th century we were Hebrews. We weren't Jews, we were Hebrews. Because Jew was negative even for us. We didn't want to be identified with that word, or many people did, not everybody. And a very striking example is that the synagogal, that's the right pronunciation, organization of the Reform movement used to be known as the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Hebrew congregations. And now, probably longer ago than I think, what is it now? 20 years ago, I'm not sure. They changed the name to the Union for Reform Judaism. Now we're Jews. We're not Hebrews. We're Jews. It took a little while for that to happen. So sometimes the valence of names are contested, and other people attribute to our identity something negative, and we have to, speaking of Jacob again, sort of wrest it back from them and to say, no, you see in this something that's shameful. I see something positive. Okay, this is a good time. Oh, sorry, Julio. I should have given you the warning, but better late than never. So let's take a moment now to see if there are questions or comments that we should talk about.
Sure. So there were, okay. The one question that came in was about the, the idea of naming someone else and the hierarchy that implies, which I'm not sure. I mean, you talked about the problem of, a woman's entire identity being derivative from a man, but which is a little bit different from, right? We also have the first human naming the animals, sort of this naming from above.
Right.
I don't know if you want to address that. I mean, it's connected to what you were just talking about with the anti-Semitic comment, but it's bigger than that.
So I guess I don't know if I should say it now, but what I will say is I'll answer it by saying that the next thing we're going to be talking about is the significance of changing names. And sometimes, of course, in the Bible, it is God or someone else who changes the name, and that's still from above. But what we're going to be talking about is the way in which we can change our own name. So yes, and sometimes, and listen, if you think about it, that's what woman with a Y is. You're taking back your name and you're making it something that means something positive to you rather than something negative. And of course, there is a tension. What the heck? I'll tell a story now that sort of illustrates this. So if you look at my birth certificate, it says Elliot Benjamin Diamond. And these days, especially after 9/11, for plane tickets, the IRS, most tradespeople, because trying to get them to say Eliezer, forget it. It just doesn't work. So I'm Elliot, but here I am, Eliezer Diamond. So how did that happen? The answer is that I think maybe it was actually in the wake of the '67 war, but I had this sort of ethnic awakening in the mid '60s. I was going to Mosheva, which was a religious Zionist camp, and I was in Bnei Akiva, and I started to feel, I really want to be Eliezer. I really want to be Elliot. That I don't connect with that name. And my brother, who was Melvin, became Menachem. He made a really smart choice, I have to say. Now, my parents came to Mosheva. We were in Mosheva, and they said, "We're here to visit Elliot and Melvin." And the person at the desk said, not sure who you mean. And then eventually it became clear that Eliezer and Menachem were Elliot and Melvin. And my parents, they're they were good religious people and everything. They were upset because they had given us identities. Sure, you can use your Hebrew name to be called to the Torah, that's fine. But in the world, you're Elliot and Melvin. And we had decided that wasn't who we were in the world. We were Eliezer and Menachem. And it took my parents a while to accept that because we had, in a sense, seized power over our identities. And we had changed them. So, yeah.
So many thoughts in response to that, but I will not share them right now. Another comment that came up was about God's multiple. Well, actually, this person didn't ask about God's multiple names. They asked about, you mentioned the idea of names being limited, and then should not God be unnameable? And I guess where I already went with the question was thinking about the multiplicity of names of God in our texts. But why don't you comment on that instead of me?
Well, right. So God, if anyone has to have many names, it's God. Because God is everything and no one thing. And if we all remember when Moses, when God is trying unsuccessfully to get Moses to want to lead the people. He never gets Moses to want to lead the people. He gets Moses to agree to do it reluctantly, which I love. I mean, right? God has power over everything except for one thing: human free will. God doesn't have power. He can't make somebody want something that person doesn't want. And he got frustrated. God gets angry. Like, what's with this guy? I'm offering this job. You should take it. Anyway, Moses says to God, the people are going to ask me, who sent me? What shall I say? And God says, Ehyeh. Say, Ehyeh asher Ehyeh sent me. Now, Ehyeh, Aleph Hey, Yud Hey, is clearly a play on Yud Hey, Vav Hey, right? The name of God, which basically means being. God is the ultimate being. But Ehyeh asher Ehyeh, I will be that which I will be, can be read, and I choose to read it this way as, you can ask my name, but you know what? I'm going to be who I'm going to be. I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that. I cannot be captured in a name. We cannot do that with God. So what we do is we give God many names that reflect different aspects of God's nature. But in the end, who is God? Ehyeh asher Ehyeh. God is many more things than we will ever be able to comprehend. And that's part of the difference between God and us. I am many things. I will never be a concert pianist, even if I start now. I will not get there. Each of us has things that we are, or even maybe at this point we could be, and then there are things that we are not and never will be. God is everything. God is ultimate possibility. Should we take another one, or should we get back to our regularly scheduled program?
Why don't we do one more?
Okay.
So someone mentioned the idea of God's naming. Right? God starts naming things before humans are named. Right, naming light and dark, for example. And the person asks, does that imply that God already intended to create an other, because the essence of communication is the desire to be understood by another? I'm reading the question as being, right, that something inherent is in naming is differentiation.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, that's absolutely true. And if you are XYZ, one of the things that means is you are not me. And that's part of the important. It's so complicated, right? On the one hand, naming is imperialistic if I'm a parent naming a child. But on the other hand, I'm acknowledging you're not mini me. I mean, there are people who name their children, Andrew Jr. or whatever. I can't speak to that. It's something that is not quite in my wheelhouse, and it's interesting. And I can understand reasons why people do that. But certainly if you give somebody a different name, yes, you're imposing a name, but you're also acknowledging from the beginning, from the moment you are born, you are apart from me. You are a different person. And God, I like the idea, I don't know how this is going to sound. God was lonely. Can you imagine being God? Nothing else exists. What do you do all day? I mean, there isn't even a day. So what do you do? And I think that God, in created something that by definition was different from God's self, but also was different from God's self. It was something to which God could relate. There's a great book by James Kugel called God of Old. And he talks about how today, philosophers talk about finding God, or, in general, even in the spiritual world, we talk about finding God. The biblical God didn't work that way. The biblical God got impatient and he would just break in, right? So God appears to Abraham and says, go forth from this land. And Abraham's like, what? But there he is. There's God, or whatever. There God is. So God wants to initiate dialogue. God wants to be involved in human history. But first, God has to take God's Lego set and build this world. And that's what God does in the first chapter of Genesis. But again, what God does is, for the most part, God creates a world that is subservient to God. It's a world that can't talk back, put it that way. And then God creates human beings. And for whatever reason, God creates beings who can talk back, who can disobey, who have minds of their own. That's the world that God chose to create. And maybe that's because if, as I say, God was lonely, the kind of company that God wanted was not the kind of company that simply is a reflection of you. It's just you played out. It's a different being who knows how to be different. And of course, it's, as Professor Saul Lieberman once says, who's the most tragic figure in the Bible? And his answer was God. God trying to create this thing, and he thinks it's going to go a certain way, and human beings disappoint him, so he tries again. But I don't know. But God doesn't give up on us, and we don't give up on God. Okay, I think it's time to move on. Like 90% of that, I didn't know I was going to say at any point, but I think it was worth saying. Okay, so we're on source 5. And no, yeah. Okay, so we're going back to Jacob. So what happens to Jacob? So Jacob is stuck with this name, Yaakov, which to begin with doesn't necessarily have that positive a meaning. And then his brother Esau gives it a really negative meaning. And finally, God sends an angel, whatever you understand to be going on there, to wrestle with Jacob. The psychologically oriented say Jacob is wrestling with himself. Could be. That's what's great about the Torah. It doesn't spell it out. It's left for us to read it as we choose to read it. And so at the end of that struggle, it says, your name shall no longer be Jacob, Yaakov, but Israel, Yisrael. For you have striven, Sarita, Yisrael, Sarita, striven, with beings divine and human, and have prevailed. So the action is different from the Jacob of the past, and the name is different. And those two go together, because who is Jacob all his life? He tricks people, and then he runs away, right? He tricks Esau, and then he runs away to Aram. He tricks Lavan, and he runs away. And now he has to meet his brother. So he doesn't run away, because he figures he can't run away. But is he going to be the same old Jacob? By the way, spoiler alert, to some extent, he did end up being the same old Jacob, right? When Esau says to him, come, my brother, come with me to say here, right? Jacob says, you know what, if I'm not there, start without me. You start out, and then I'll find you. That's a Jacob move. That's not an Israel move. But anyway, in this moment, Jacob is striving with the adversary, hand-to-hand combat. And this symbolizes the fact that he is ready to become a different person, Yisrael, a person who strives with beings divine and human. Now, again, the name is being conferred by God. Jacob doesn't confer this name on himself. But this is an example of you can change your name. You can become a different person, and often that can be encapsulated in that name. When Cassius Clay, and I'll be coming back to him later, became a Muslim, he became Muhammad Ali. Same thing for Lou Alcindor. When he became a Muslim, he became Karim Abdul-Jabbar. So that was a way of saying, I'm not the person I was. I'm choosing a new identity for myself. And again, here it's God who's choosing it, but there's a message here. We can become someone else. We can choose a new identity. All right, let's look at the next source, source 6. Now here we're going to look at 2 rabbinic sources that talk about the significance of changing names. Now, in the first case, once again, it's God who's changing the name. And in the second case, it is I who changes the name. Well, actually, in this source, it's complicated. Both possibilities are in this source. God changing names and we ourselves changing our name. So Rabbi Yitzchak said, a person's sentence, right, the decree that God makes on Rosh Hashanah is torn up, right? We have to imagine that our decree is written in a document and notarized and posted. This is the decree for blah, 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 blah for the coming year. And now person's sentence is torn up on account of 4 types of actions. These are giving charity, crying out in prayer, a change of one's name, and a change of one's deeds for the better. So giving charity, okay, crying out in prayer, I get, changing one's deeds for the better, fine. What do you mean changing one's name? If I change my name from, I don't know, like is it that when the destroyer, the angels, the destroyer comes to find me, they don't find me because I have a different name. So, oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking for somebody else. I mean, it makes no sense. And I think it's clear that what a change of name means, it's sort of what the next thing says, a change of one's deeds for the better. But I think what it really means is to dig deep inside myself and to say, I don't need to be the person I am or have been. I can be different. And I'm taking on a name that sums up this new being that I want to become. And that name will be a reminder for me to be that new person. And then inevitably the rabbis quote biblical sources. So the proof text that a change of one's name makes a difference, as it is written. As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be. And it is written there, and I will bless her, and I will also give you a son from her. And here it's a little bit mystical, right? Like the woman known as Sarai was not capable of giving birth. God had to create this new person, a person who was capable of giving birth. So the woman formerly known as Sarai became Sarah. And this woman was capable, something about that change of name. Again, you can see it simply as being something mystical, and at some level, I think it is. But but the link that the rabbis make between this verse and their statement, their earlier statement, suggests that these kinds of name changes mean that there's some profound change that happens within the person, and the name change is just a reflection of that profound change. And let's look at source number 6. Number 7. Never mind. 7. This is from Maimonides' Laws of Repentance. And Maimonides here is talking about the paths of repentance. How do you get to repentance? He says, among the paths of repentance is for the penitent to constantly call out before God, perform charity, separate oneself far from the object of sin. This is what in AA they call persons, places, and things. You want to avoid past behaviors you have to avoid the context in which those behaviors took place. Or as they also say, no one goes to a crack house to sit in the non-smoking section. All right, and D is to change his name as if to say, I am a different person and not the same one who sinned. So of course, it doesn't mean that changing the name itself makes a difference. You're actually making a demand on yourself. You're imagining this new person and you're calling this person, doesn't really matter, Isaiah, I don't know. And when you make it your name, you're saying, now I have to inhabit this name. I have to be the person that this name represents. That is the power of name change. Okay, let's move on to source B1. Okay. Now here we have something interesting. We have something of a paradox. And actually, Maimonides talks about this in the laws of repentance, which is, let's say that I'm changing my name because I regard my past. Let's say in particular, I am what people call a Baal Tshuva, which maybe I'm going to say it. We have to be very careful with that term because it's like Jew. Like on the one hand, say, oh, wow, someone is a Baal Tshuva. The Talmud says, "B'makom shebalei tshuva omdim ein tzadikim yicholim la'amod." In a place where someone who has repented stands, even the righteous cannot stand. But on the other hand, too often you hear someone say, he's a Baal Tshuva. Meaning, of course, like he's overly sincere and he's too from, because what do you expect? He's one of those Balei Tshuva, got religion late in life and is going overboard. Any name can have a negative and a positive. And if we're going to use that term, which actually I'm not thrilled about using altogether, I don't think people are people. I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish. I'm doing now what I'm doing now. That's it. But if you're going to use it, it should be used as a term of respect, not as a term of denigration. Okay, enough. So I was lost and now I'm found. But to stay found, I have to remember that I was lost. The paradox, but it's true. I need to know, again, I'll take an AA example. A person gets up at an AA meeting and says, my name is blah, 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 blah. I'm a recovering alcoholic. Let's parse that. I'm recovering. I'm not drinking anymore. And not am I only not drinking, I'm sober. I'm working the 12 steps of AA. But I'm an alcoholic. In other words, I have the potential to go back to where I was. And for me to stay where I am, I need to know that. I need to be eternally vigilant. So that's what we're talking about here. A person who made a mistake in the past needs particular vigilance from falling into his past ways. The book of Psalms states, thoroughly cleanse me of my transgression and purify me from my sin, for I know my crime well, and my sin is always before me, is before me always. And now let's skip down to the next bolded part. On the other hand, excessive attention to past misdeeds can be an obstacle to putting them behind us. A competing opinion in the Talmud claims that someone who repeats confession on a past misdeed is likened to a colorful biblical image as a dog who returns to his own vomit. So is a fool who persists in his folly. So we can't handcuff ourselves by remaining too fixed on what was, what we did. You have to be able to move on. I'll tell you something that I experienced, which to me reflects this so powerfully. So without getting into details, there were turbulent years in my life. And during that time, only once I became a parent did I have some sense of how difficult those years were for my parents. And many years later, actually, is when my father was living with us during COVID. I said to him, Dad, as a parent, I've come to understand how difficult those years must have been for you. And I'm sorry because I know I must have caused you pain. And my father said, forget it. That happened. Got it together. You're a great son. You're a great husband. You're a great father. That's it. That's what we're talking about. So I needed to acknowledge, but my father was also saying to me, okay, true, we both know that. And now let's focus on who you are, not on who you were. And I think that's the balance here. I need to be vigilant, but I need to know I actually have changed. I actually have become someone else. Okay, again, I didn't give you a warning, but at least this is the, let's stop here and see if there are other questions.
I will share a question, but in the meantime, so many people have been asking if you can repeat the names of those 3 books that you mentioned at the beginning.
I certainly can, and I will. And they are Damaged Identities, Narrative Repair by Hilda Lindemann Nelson. Holding and Letting Go, The Social Practice of Personal Identities by Hilda Lindemann. Social, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect by Matthew D. Lieberman, who is, I forget now, a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Okay. They're all great books. I recommend all of them.
Okay, we will add them to the source sheet after the fact. So if we'll put them in the chat, but also if folks want to check back, they will they'll be on the source sheet online as well. Thank you. Well, this is something that you and I have been talking about for a long time, and you helped me. You helped me through a situation in rabbinical school, actually, when you were just my teacher, not yet my friend. Where I was feeling really defined by something that I had done that had caused a lot of hurt. So it's there's this tricky balance between owning who you've been and what you've done, and also not being defined by it. Someone raised the contrast between Maimonides and Buber in this regard, and it just even the very term Shuvah that you mentioned and taught us about before in another webinar, right? Are you returning to yourself? There's an implication of kind of that other person isn't me. It's tricky there. I don't know if you want to comment further than what you already said.
Yeah, I don't know what I could say more, except being the inveterate storyteller that I am, I will tell you the following story. One of my children had a very difficult adolescence. Among other things, it involved drugs. And it involved stealing to pay for the drugs. And many years later, he got himself straightened out. He said, I need to go to rehab. And he did. I'm so proud of him in so many ways. He's just a wonderful person and a wonderful son. So many years later, a friend of his from this period contacted him on Facebook and contacted him to excoriate him. He said, my mother just died, and you will never be able to apologize to her for what you did. You stole money from her purse. You took some of her jewels or jewelry, whatever it was. And you never will be able to apologize. And my son, God bless him, wrote, "You are right. I was a thief. I was a liar. I was a cheat. I was an addict. And I'm not any of those things anymore." And I thought that that was so powerful because he was able to do both. He was able to say, I know where I came from. I know what I'm capable of. But I also need to affirm that I'm not that anymore. I have a different name now. And that name is just as real as the names that you just gave me. And the name that I have now is more important because it represents the now. And the now is what's most important. So that's what I would say. Okay, let's move on.
So I actually have printed out on my bulletin board here your outline of what it means to do repentance that you shared with us in a High Holiday webinar. But one of the steps that there's a whole it's just out of eyesight. It's too far for me to read from where I'm sitting right now, but you have, I believe, acknowledgement and asking for forgiveness and, really acknowledging the harm that you've done as an inherent part of the process of repentance. I think it's part of what you were just talking about, that you can move on yourself, and also you can't only move on yourself. There are other people who ideally need to move on as well, and kind of owning who you were to them.
Right. And my son was doing both.
Right.
He wasn't just saying, well, yeah, that was back then. So you're right. I own it. But I also now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. I think we should look at the next source. Okay. So now what we're going to see here is that we can lose our credibility when we change our name. We just talked about the fact that we have to remember who we were to keep being who we are. And in fact, tragically, we can lose who we are and go back to who we were. And there's a striking example of this in the Torah. So we know that Jacob becomes Israel, and it should be said, right? Jacob never stops being Jacob. He's known as Jacob, but also Israel. But also Jacob. He's never exclusively Jacob, which, if you want, homiletically, you could say means that struggle with the angel never really stops. It's Jacob's struggle with himself. He's struggling to be Israel, but it's hard for him. It's hard for him to be Israel. He goes back into being Jacob. And in any case, the prophet Jeremiah, so now we're in the period of the end of the First Temple period and destruction, says in excoriating the people of Israel, he says, Ish meireu ishameru val kol ach al tiftachu ki kol ach akov Yaakov v'chol rea Rachel yaloch. Each of you beware of your friend, trust not even your kinsfolk. For every sibling, ach, akov Yaakov, and here the translation takes advantage, but I'm going to use my translation. Every brother tries to circumvent his brother. Every person tries to circumvent somebody else, even the person that they're close to, right? It's not an accident that they're using the word ach, right? They're saying that, Jeremiah is saying to the people that you, in your behavior, have jumped or slid all the way back to Jacob in his worst days. Jacob the deceiver, Jacob the circumventer, who circumvented and deceived his his brother. And that's what's happening now. You have adopted that behavior for yourself. So I can't call you Yisrael anymore. You're not Yisrael. You're Yaakov, and in the worst sense of the word. So we need to know that just taking another name is not enough. We have to live it. And if we don't live it, our old name and our old identity can come back to haunt us. Okay, let's continue. So now I want to talk about what to me is a very interesting situation, which is if I want to take on a new name, and we've just said this, I have to acknowledge the past. And here's what gets tricky. What constitutes an acknowledgement? So we have two political figures here. One is Ralph Northam, who's the Attorney General in Virginia, and one, a candidate for sheriff in South Carolina. And both of them wore blackface at some earlier point in their lives. Northam when he was at a college party, and Stivender also at some party. And they both want to claim that was me then, that's not me now. I am not. So if we have to pick a name, let's pick the name racist. Right? Maybe I was a racist back then, but I'm not a racist now. And I am showing you that in part, and here's the key, by recognizing how wrong my behavior was back then. So let's read first. Well, rather than leading the witness, first I'm just going to read each. So on the left, Northam. And I want to thank Ellie Gettinger for suggesting that I set it up this way. So Virginia Attorney General admits to wearing blackface at 1980 college party. This was a one-time occurrence, and I accept full responsibility for my conduct. That conduct clearly shows that as a young man, I had a callous and inexcusable lack of awareness and insensitivity to the pain my behavior could inflict on others. It was really a minimization of both people and color, of color, and a minimization of a horrific history I knew well, even then. So look at the elements in this. First of all, in fairness to himself, he says it is a one-time occurrence. So he's asking us to take that into account. But he doesn't follow that by saying, well, you know, there's a blip on the screen. It happened once. No, he says, I accept full responsibility. Yeah, it may have been once, but it was terrible. It was wrong. And he admits that that action shows something about his character at that time, that he had a lack of awareness and insensitivity to the pain he could inflict on others. And it wasn't just a behavior that could hurt other people. It was a behavior that symbolized or manifested a mindset, a minimization of people of color, right? And a minimization of their history. It wasn't just that it was hurtful, it was that it reflected a certain mindset. And in effect, giving a certain name to a certain group of people, less than. They're not human in the same way that I am. Now let's look at Stivender's. So Craig Stivender insists on the right side, there was no racial bias or motivation, adding that if this was the case, he would not have attended the party with a Black woman. Calls her a friend he's known since 6th grade, who he says did not question the blackface. To be honest with you, 10 years ago, when the party took place, I had never heard of blackface, he said. I didn't know it was a legitimate thing. Well, we could unmute everybody, but I'm assuming that if we did, I think most, if not all of us, would agree that on the left, we have a successful name change, racist to not racist. I don't know what the positive formulation should be. On the right, and this is the paradox, we have someone who never really accepts the racist elements of what he did. And so we cannot trust him to give him a new name now, not racist. Right? Well, I attended with a Black woman, so I'm not really a racist. She didn't say anything. I didn't know that there was anything wrong with it. It wasn't a thing back then. Right, 10 years ago. Okay, so this is an excellent illustration of how we cannot move, we cannot put behind us our old names and take on a new one if we don't name the old name, if we don't acknowledge that old name and that it applied to us at some point. And when we acknowledge it, then we make it clear, this is what I'm leaving. And I know that I was in that place. I think that Northam is able to do that. I think that Stivender is not. That means, I guess, what you might call a non-apology apology. But the point is, Stivender is not willing to do the hard work. The hard work of having to look at himself and say, that was terrible. You know, like the language that Northam used, it was terrible. I was diminishing people. I was making fun of them. That was wrong. I want to be somebody else now. Okay. Let's look at the next source. Just a second. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I don't know. Okay, you can ignore the first part of the Hebrew then. All right, so this is a Mishnah. And here what we're talking about is it's the opposite of what we just talked about. Not people who are incapable of moving on because they don't leave their pasts behind them, but who are incapable of moving on because other people don't let them move on. So the Mishnah says, just as there is a prohibition against exploitation in buying and selling, ona'ah in Hebrew, so too there is ona'ah in statements. I will be honest, I don't fully understand why the same Hebrew term refers to these two phenomena, but let's roll with it. That's the term the rabbis use. So what is ona'ah? Verbal mistreatment. So I guess your mistreatment is the common denominator. And the Mishnah lists other examples. If one is a penitent, and I alluded to this before, another may not say to him, remember your earlier deeds. You know, great, yeah, you're such a pious person now, and you go to synagogue all the time, you do this, you do that, but remember, you weren't always that way. You used to be, you hung out on the street, mischief. You weren't that high and mighty person you are today. So that is what Lindemann calls holding someone badly. We're insisting on holding them to an identity that they have rejected, and they've come by it honestly. I mean, they have done the work. They have done the hard work of moving away from who they had been and taking on, and sometimes it literally happens with names. I have people say to me, and I just really want to punch out their lights. I used to work with Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, and people would say to me, yeah, I remember when he was Steve. Like, really? Yeah, okay. And guess what? His name still is Stephen. But he's Shlomo. That's who he chooses to be. The fact that he once went by that name is not really relevant. And when you say that, What you're really doing is exactly what this Mishnah says. Remember your earlier deeds. You weren't always Rabbi Shlomo Riskin. You were somebody else. Not so great. Why? Why would you do that? I mean, I guess you get a rush out of it. And we'll talk, I hope, not so sure we'll be able to do it, a little bit about that. And now another example, and we see this one all the time too. If one is the child of converts, another may not say to him, remember the deeds of your ancestors, as it is stated. And this verse tells us that we shouldn't do this. And a convert shall you neither mistreat, nor shall you oppress him. You know, the Mishnah, the Talmud says, Ger shenitgayer kekatan shenolad dami. Someone who joins the Jewish people is newborn, born again, if you want. Now, I will admit that to me that has some negative connotations, but the positive connotation is a person is entitled to a new beginning. And it's totally up to them what they want to say or not say about their past. It is not for us to bring it up, to ask about it, unless we have that kind of relationship where it's appropriate. We have to hold them well, not badly. Through their thoughts, through their actions, they have told us who they are and who they want to be. And we have to hear that and reflect it back to them. That is holding someone well. And when we stand in the way of someone taking on a new identity, we are attacking just as much as if we punched them in the face. We are attacking them. We are assaulting their identity. Okay. And actually, yeah, in this connection, I mentioned before Cassius Clay and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. So people may or may not remember, Clay changed his name in 1964 after he beat Sonny Liston in an upset for the world title in boxing. He became a Muslim, and he changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. And many, many sports writers would not acknowledge that. They wrote about him as Cassius Clay. That's your name. Isn't that the name your mother gave you? That's your name. No, this Muhammad Ali business, that's ridiculous. So what are these people doing? They are holding Muhammad Ali badly. They are saying, we will not allow you, we will not legitimate, we will not respect the new identity that you have taken on for yourself. That's what they're doing. And that's tremendously damaging, and it's arrogant. Every person has the right to take on the identity that they think is right for themselves, especially when it's not just changing the name. He's changing his religious affiliation. The name is just a reflection of a deep inner change, and it should have been respected. Okay. Now we come to a difficult thing. This is C1, which is, I talked about how we have to affirm and respect people's personalities. We should not attribute negative interpretations of their names, their personalities. But let's face it, people act badly. We all act badly sometimes. And there is a prohibition of lashon hara, right? Of not sharing with others negative information about someone. But we can't go through life never saying anything. First of all, it's just hard to do it. But it's also can't be the way life works. Sometimes it's important to share negative information. And the Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael HaKohen Kagan, in his work, Chafetz Chaim, which is about lashon hara, right? And lashon hara is, I'm going to call it damaging speech. Damaging speech as a translation. And he acknowledges in the introduction. It's fascinating that he says this. He says, if the evil inclination sees that it cannot overcome someone in this way by tempting one to speak Lashon Hara, it deceives one through the opposite tactic by insisting on such a stringent definition of Lashon Hara so as to convince, that's my typo, to convince one that everyone else says, everything one says about someone else falls into this category. And if this is to be so, one cannot live in this world until one separates oneself from all worldly matters. If I can never say anything negative about anybody, how the heck can I live in the world? So he's saying, I'm writing this book about not speaking negatively about other people. But I want to say at the outset that my goal is to create a livable way of fulfilling this commandment. Otherwise, I didn't have to write a book. I could have written one line. Don't speak Lashon Hara. I'm saying it's not that simple. Sometimes we have to say negative things. The trick is, what are those times? And even more important, how do we say it? And now we go to the next source where we'll see that is dealt with. Okay, so this is actually quoted in the Chafetz Chaim, I believe. But anyway, this is from Sefer Hasidim for the 12th century. These people were known as the German pietists in English, Hasidei Ashkenaz. Very interesting people. So they're writing here about Lashon Hara L'To'elet. Let's call it purpose-driven negative sharing, a purpose-driven sharing of negative information. That's somewhat clumsy, but that's what we're talking about. Sharing negative information for a purpose, constructive purpose. And they write here, if someone sees that something is being entrusted to one's parent or teacher and knows they will not handle the money or object responsibly, one should dissuade them from entrusting the object and reveal the truth to them. In other words, you go to the person who's about to give the money or the object to your parent or your teacher, even if it's your parent, even if it's your teacher, and say, I wouldn't do that. Bad idea. And one should not say about one's parent or teacher that they are evil people, but rather should share the truth with those who are responsible community leaders. In other words, the truth being that this is the reason I'm telling you that I think you shouldn't do it. And the key here is what I call, and I think I said this before, I did say it, the difference between description and characterization. I know that my parents don't handle other people's property responsibly. I can say that when it needs to be said. What I can't say is, my parents are evil people. That's a characterization. When I share negative information, I need as much as possible to describe and not characterize. I know that someone was accused of embezzlement and someone's planning to hire this person. I can say, I think you should be careful because I know this person was accused. I don't know exactly what happened, but I think you should have this information. What I can't say is, this person is a ganef. That's a characterization, not a description. And this is often hard to do in life. And it's particularly hard with people we don't like. Because our mind jumps to negative characterization. But the trick is to say, what can I find in this person that is good? Because very few people have no good in them. The only one maybe is Tony Soprano's mother. That might be the only person I know who didn't have any good, but everybody else does. No, but seriously, so we can enumerate the ways in which people hurt us, in which they're wrong, and they're people. They're not monsters. I mean, as C.S. Lewis once said when he's talking about forgiveness, he says, let's not start with the Nazis. And I understand there are some cases where, how could this possibly work? But we don't live with Nazis. We live with people, including people who hurt us badly. So, let's talk now about what we're ending at 2:30. All right, so let's just get in the last item in this category. Very, very difficult one. And even though we have almost no time, okay. So this is about, when is Lashon Hara permitted in politics? In politics. What are we allowed to report? That's true about politicians. So this is from an article, as you can see below, from Azriel Ariel, Lashon Hara in the context of a communal democratic system. And he says, in an open democratic regime, there is a basic obligation for every public figure to be a trusted servant of the public and to supply a full accounting of one's political activities, actions, shortcomings. Therefore, one cannot avoid doing so by seeking protection by appealing to the prohibitions against Lashon Hara and Rechilut. Rechilut is talebearing. Public sharing of information, debate are an inseparable part of the contract between the public and its elected officials. Even Moses provided a full accounting of his use of the donations in behalf of the construction of the Mishkan in fulfillment of the verse, and you shall be free of guilt in the eyes of God and Israel. Not enough to be free of guilt in the eyes of God. So, but he then goes on to say, but obviously not everything that's said in the political arena needs to be said. And he says, if so, what is the leniency upon which one can rely upon to justify what seems to be sinful behavior? Some of the more outrageous remarks, and now he's talking about the Knesset. It would seem that one could say as follows: in the Knesset, the television cameras are always present. An elected official knows that everything one says will be made public. Thus, the official accepts the sharing of information. So he's saying you can share anything that a Knesset member says, but not the commentary and criticism that is not relevant. And of course, it's so easy to know what that means. Not easy at all. What is relevant, what is not? Maybe I'll just sort of tell on myself. Before the writer's strike, one of my guilty pleasures was Stephen Colbert's monologue. Now, he is a political satirist, among other things. But I myself know, A, I probably shouldn't be watching the monologues at all. But B, there are certain moments where I know I shouldn't be watching and where I actually turn away. So when Stephen Colbert makes fun of, what's his name again, Trump's son, Eric, and even does a thing with his lip to imitate him, that's not political commentary. That's just cruel. It's just cruel. And it's very difficult. We live in a world where talk about the public's right to know and share of information, and all of that is true. But we also have to acknowledge that so much of what is said, even when it's true, is just destructive. It does not serve a positive purpose. And I don't know, and here I'm saying all this, and now I've been saved from watching Colbert, but it's really, it's a question in my own mind. Should I really go back to it? I enjoy it, but I'm enjoying something that really is mean and destructive. I don't have the answer, but I'm raising my own consciousness and thereby raising yours. These are things that we really, really need to think about, and especially in the polarized era in which we live. How much permission do we have to ridicule people with whom we disagree? And what purpose does it serve? And what does it do to us? These are important questions. Ad kan, as we say, here endeth the lesson.
Thank you so much. There's I wish we had another hour and a half. So I just want to, it's not really fair because you don't have time to address them, but I just want to give voice to two things that were coming up repeatedly in the chat. So one is about trans people and that whole aspect of letting go of previous names and identities, and kind of what that expects of other people who have connected to and loved and remember those previous identities. So there's that piece that several people raised.
But I have to say one thing. That's one piece of it. But the other piece of it is people who will not allow a trans person to take on that new identity. You have male genitalia, you're a he, or there's no such thing as they. It's terrible. I mean, you're denying a person the identity that they have chosen, not easily, to put it mildly, for themselves. That's just a crime. It's a crime.
Agreed.
Sorry, I just had to get that out.
Yeah, the comments, right, I didn't even say that because it seems almost a given, but it's not a given. And right, the comments that were coming in were from people who respect, and lift up the new identities, and also, right, and also feel connected to the old, their own memories, in positive ways.
Listen, if it was hard for my parents to accept that I was now Eliezer and not Elliot, I can only imagine how difficult it is for a parent, let's say, to accept a child who has now taken on a different sexual identity. Easy, it's not. But that's part of our job as parents and as people, to be able to hold a person in the identity that they want. That's one of the messages here today.
And another theme that came up is just kind of the fine line between describing and characterizing, especially in the context of kind of warning people, this person's a predator, this person's a narcissist, right? There's, right, you're defining, but there's also a goal. And anyway, that was another
predator,
theme that came up.
I would say predator is a characterization. It's not a description. I would say this person, I mean, it might sound silly to some people listening, but this person has sexually abused. This person has taken advantage of. Those are descriptions. I'm not saying predator is inaccurate, but it globalizes in a way I think is not entirely fair to the person.
Because you're saying the implication is that that's all this person is.
Right. So that's it. Now they wear the scarlet letter.
Yeah. I mean, it also it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, and kind of the idea of are we, to what extent are we fully defined by our names, and to what extent are we also, is it a piece of us and we're also more than that?
Can I tell a story?
So let me just formally close, and then yes.
Yeah, anyone wants to hear it, can
and there's much to say about public discourse and dehumanization, as you were alluding to at the end. So we'll need to have other sessions on all of these, but I just wanted to thank you so much for teaching us today, and taking the series and the theme in this direction. And as soon as I'm done speaking, I'll share the link to your other webinar that I referred to, and some additional links. I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and invite you to join us again next week, same time, same place. Professor Eitan Fishbane will be teaching about Tikkun Olam and healing and changing the world, and even the Kabbalistic idea of how human beings can change God. So that is next week. So we are officially closed, and please, Rabbi Diamond, continue with whatever you want to share with us.
Okay, nobody has to listen to this, but I feel the need to tell the story. And it's going to be hard for some people to hear this story. I've never experienced sexual molestation. I cannot imagine what it's like. A former student of mine, Rabbi, was accused of not molesting, but something having to do with child pornography. And when I learned this, I turned to the head of the Rabbinical Assembly and I said, and he was arrested. And I called the head of the Rabbinical Assembly and I said, has anyone contacted him? And he said, no. And I contacted him and I said, I don't know what you did. I don't really want to know what you did. Do you want to do tshuva? Because if you do, let's you and I study. Let's get you started on dealing with what you did and trying to find a road back. Again, I want to emphasize, I wasn't saying this person shouldn't be punished. I wasn't saying that what this person was terrible. What I was saying is that this person is a person, and he's more than the terrible thing that he did. A little bit afterwards, invited me to a circle of blessing. Now, this is something that's done in African communities. When someone has done something wrong, they gather in the village square, and the person sits in the middle. And the people all around that person remind them of all the good things they've done. So what are they doing? They're telling him, your sin is not your name. Your sin is not you. You will have to pay the price. You have hurt someone in a way that they may never forgive you. And you may not deserve to be forgiven. And you are more than that sin. So his sister-in-law knew about this, arranged a circle of blessing for this person. And I drove 7 hours to be there. And it was worth every mile. People said to this person, let me tell you what you did for me. And there were like 18 people there and 30 or 40 or however many people there were on the screen. I mean, even as I'm telling it, at one point I said to him, you know, one day this is going to be done for all of us. Just one catch. We'll be dead. You know, at the funeral, people will talk about, you know, all the wonderful things. I said, you are so fortunate. You, in your lifetime, are having all these people come and remind you of all the goodness that is in you. If I'm causing pain to anyone who's experienced molestation, I apologize. But I hope my intention here is clear. My intention is simply that, and the right people have to do it. You know, you don't expect the person who was molested to walk over to the molester and throw their arms around. And people have the absolute right to not forgive. But the community, I believe, has an obligation to keep the personhood of that person before them and to balance our abhorrence at what they did with the recognition of their humanity and to give them a way forward, to give them a way for tshuva. Either we believe in tshuva or we don't. I mean, tshuva is only what? If I mixed my milk pot with my meat pot, I mean, tshuva has to be tshuva for everything. And it doesn't eliminate a lot of things. It doesn't eliminate prison. It doesn't eliminate many, many things. But it allows for spiritual redemption. And everyone is entitled to that if they want it. If they don't want it, nothing to talk about. But I can't tell you, as I said, I don't know if I will ever have another experience like that in my life. And it just affirmed for me the importance of affirming the personhood of each and every human being, even when it's really, really hard to do it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
It's very powerful, and based on some things that are coming in my own thoughts, I would say, right, and that person also needs to affirm the humanity of those who were hurt, and
Yes.
and
Yes, yes,
Right.
yes. Sorry, I didn't say that. Absolutely, yes. And I would say this, the person has to recognize that one of the reasons what happened is because that person did not affirm the humanity
Right.
of those people. That's one of the reasons it happened.
Thank you for that. Much more to discuss on another day. Thanks to everyone for staying for some extra really thought-provoking material, which is what you always share with us, Rabbi Diamond. So thank you so much for your wisdom and teaching, and hope you'll come teach us again soon.
God willing. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.